welcome to the deep dive. You sent us something, well, really quite remarkable this time.
It is. Excerpts from a YouTube transcript. Pope Leo XIV responding to a letter from Captain Ibrahim Troaré'S,
President of Burkina Faso. Yeah.
And this isn't just, diplomatic niceties.
No, not at all. It feels like a really significant conversation.
Yeah.
Spiritual power, political power.
Exactly. Touching on some deep historical wounds, but also maybe future possibilities for Africa, for the church.
Right. So our mission here, for you listening, is to really dig into this. Go beyond just a summary of the Pope's response. It's long, it's comprehensive.
It really is.
We want to pull out the core insights, the key themes he's hitting in reply to President Troaré'S.
And the range is incredible. You've got the church's past actions, the colonial history,
Economic injustice, which is huge.
political interference, sovereignty, migration, that whole crisis.
Cultural respect, the future of Africa and the church.
It covers so much ground. It's quite a task to unpack it all.
Okay, so let's start where he starts, really. The church's history in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't just vaguely say mistakes were made, does he?
No, he's surprisingly specific. He talks openly about the church aligning itself with colonial powers.
Standing with the colonizers.
Yeah, standing beside them, not the people being oppressed. He uses this really potent image.
Which one?
Salvation getting tangled up with subjugation. The cross right there beside the flags of empire.
Wow. That's confronting stuff.
It is. And it shows a willingness, I think, to face these really uncomfortable truths.
And then he actually uses the word repentance, right? For sins of omission and commission.
He does, which for the leader of an institution like the church, that's a significant step.
It makes you think about the weight of that history.
Absolutely. It underlines that even institutions with deep moral claims have to look back, have to acknowledge where they failed.
It's not just saying sorry.
No, it's recognizing where the church itself strayed from its core message.
And importantly, he says his papacy must be different. He stresses this need to finally listen to the African voice.
A voice that's been ignored or silenced for so long.
Yeah. That feels like a potential turning point, maybe.
It could be. Now, shifting slightly to that colonial legacy, he really connects with Troaré'S' idea of chains, not just physical ones, but invisible ones, too.
Right. And he calls colonialism a spiritual betrayal. What do you think he means by that exactly?
Well, it's deeper than just politics or economics, isn't it? It's about the attempt to erase identity, to silence cultures. He mentions the poetry, the proverbs, the cosmologies, the sacred rhythms, all pushed aside.
A real sense of profound cultural loss.
Exactly. But he does add a bit of nuance, acknowledging that some missionaries were sincere, some did stand against the empire.
But that wasn't the whole story.
No. He says the broader truth, the institutional truth, often sided with power. And that honesty is, I think, quite important here.
And this leads him to commit to revisiting history, but not just to feel guilty about it.
Right. The purpose is specific, to root out denial.
Denial that still exists.
Yes. And crucially, to open doors with justice. He actually talks about the church helping foster a cultural rebirth, led by Africans themselves.
Okay, let's move to the economic injustice piece. This felt really central.
It did. He echoes Troaré'S' point about this terrible paradox.
Africa's incredible wealth.
Cobalt, gold, uranium, coltan, oil. He lists them.
Right alongside deep poverty.
And he doesn't mince words. He calls the exploitation of these gifts a curse.
A curse inflicted on the continent. The core idea being that this poverty isn't just bad luck.
Not at all. It's the result of policy, he says. Greed, engineered stagnation.
Orchestrated debt, predatory agreements. That's incredibly strong language.
It is. And then comes this moment of confession from him.
About the church.
Yes, that the church was often too quiet, maybe too cautious while all this was happening.
That's a big admission.
It feels like it. He gives these stark examples, like multinationals taking billions while communities nearby don't even have clean water.
Or resources guarded by foreign guns as they leave the continent.
Exactly. So the pledge he makes is for a fundamental change, meaning a commitment to actually name the architects of this poverty.
Not just speak vaguely.
No, to challenge the systems, the institutions, to fight for real equity, not just, hand out aid.
He uses the phrase economic repentance. I remember that.
He does. It implies dismantling the structures that cause the harm.
And working with Africans?
Yes. Partnering with African economists, theologians, reformers. And he grounds it, as he often does, in human terms.
How so?
He talks about mothers in Ouagadougou or Kinshasa or Bamako grieving because they can't find dignified work or because their children are lost trying to migrate.
So economic justice isn't just politics for him?
No, it's fundamentally moral, spiritual even.
Okay, let's talk sovereignty. Political interference. This is obviously core to President Troaré'S original letter.
And the Pope really acknowledges this long, damaging history of, well, outside forces messing with Africa's ability to determine its own path.
He paints that picture, doesn't he? Maps drawn without consent.
Borders carved up by colonial ambitions, leaders chosen or deposed by faraway interests.
But he also talks about modern interference.
Yeah, the more subtle stuff. Strategic partnerships with strings attached, aid used as leverage, foreign military bases.
Right.
And he asks these really pointed questions like, why is Africa still a playground for other powers' agendas?
Why are decisions about Africa made in foreign capitals? Why the suspicion around African elections?
Exactly. And he picks up on Troaré'S point about the double standard.
How if Africa tries to nationalize resources for its own people, it's called authoritarian.
Right. But foreign exploitation is just, free markets. He even draws a parallel to Christ under Roman occupation.
Wow. Highlighting the injustice of foreign domination.
It's powerful. And then comes this line, sovereignty is not a luxury. It is a right. It is a divine dignity.
Coming from the Pope, that carries enormous weight.
It really does. And he says the church will actively defend that right by rejecting policies that trap nations in debt, by exposing covert operations, manipulation. He even mentions Troaré'S specific concerns, like drones and whispers in the capital.
So, real-world political engagement potential.
It suggests that. He sees Africa rising and acknowledges this makes some former powers uneasy.
And he calls on other faith leaders.
Yeah, to stand up for sovereignty too. And he sends a message to Western and Eastern leaders.
What's the message?
Basically, be present in the lives of the people, not just in embassies and on airstrips.
And affirming the African voice itself.
Its inherent value. He pledges church support for transparency, opposition to puppet regimes.
And blessing only governments that come from the people.
Right. The goal being real sovereignty. Decisions made in African capitals, leaders chosen by Africans.
Okay, let's turn to migration. Such a painful human issue.
And the Pope immediately shifts the frame, doesn't he? Away from just numbers.
Yeah, to the stories. The mother and child in the sea, the young man praying.
The grandmother who doesn't even know her grandchild is gone. It's visceral.
And he points to the root cause. What does he say it is?
Despair. A despair created by a system that took the wealth and then built walls.
He uses the word hypocrisy, I think.
He does. The hypocrisy of barring the doors to people whose suffering you helped create. He talks about his own visits to migrant camps, Lampedusa, Lesbos.
That's personal for him.
Clearly. And he calls the whole crisis a moral failure, a profound one.
And he challenges the wealthy nations directly.
Says you can't just close the borders to Africa's pain if your wealth was built on Africa's back.
And then that simple, powerful statement, migration is not a crime.
Yeah. Reframing it entirely around human dignity. He points fingers too.
At who?
Warlords, profiteers, foreign consultants with their failed plans. Those are the real criminals, he implies. The border that matters most is human dignity.
He talks about why people are forced to leave. Starvation, violence.
And he urges European leaders to look at the history, to understand the drivers. But he also calls on African leaders
to do what?
To build nations worth staying in, create opportunities.
And the role of the global church.
To protect migrants as sacred lives, advocate for fair asylum laws. He reminds them the Holy Family were refugees.
And that message to migrants themselves. You are not forgotten, not invisible, not illegal in the eyes of God.
Incredibly powerful. He even calls migration itself a kind of living sermon.
How so?
A sermon confronting the powerful, demanding justice. His vision is building bridges, not borders.
Okay, moving to cultural respect, this felt like another really deep wound he was addressing.
Definitely. He talks about a theft of memory, not just wealth being stolen, but narratives, heritage.
And that this is maybe the deepest wound?
He suggests it might be. The erasure of stories, the humiliation of cultures, silencing traditions. He gives concrete examples.
Like artifacts in European museums.
Exactly. Manuscripts taken for preservation and never returned. oral history dismissed as primitive.
He calls it a looting of memory.
Yes, and he stresses how vital memory is. It's sacred. You need it to heal, to rise, to know who you are.
He mentions the Vatican archives.
Yeah, reflecting on what's there, but also what's missing. What should be on African shelves but isn't.
And he tackles the justifications for keeping artifacts.
That paternalistic, we protect what Africa cannot. We curate what Africa neglects. He calls it arrogant.
And he demands their return.
Unequivocally. Not as charity, he says, but as justice, as the start of healing.
Culture as a seed to be replanted.
Right. Masks, bronzes, manuscripts, they need to go back. He calls for restoring languages, rhythms, faiths, stories that were suppressed or destroyed.
And challenging that idea that the West interprets and Africa just imitates.
Fundamentally, he affirms Africa's own wisdom, its philosophies, its spiritual heritage having the fingerprints of God.
Predating cathedrals, he says.
Exactly. He acknowledges the pain in Troaré'S letter and insists African identity is alive, not some museum piece.
So a call to action for museums and institutions.
Unbolt the glass cases, basically. Yeah. Rebuild honor through restitution. And he connects it back to the church's mission work, too.
Saying faith shouldn't mean cultural amnesia.
Precisely. Teach theology with humility, preach Christ without erasing identity, recognize Jesus through African cultural lenses.
So cultural respect is a spiritual necessity.
Yes. He wants the church to be a safe place for all memories, the Vatican known for what it returns. Erasing culture, he says, offends the Creator.
Okay, let's get to the final major theme. Faith, prophecy, and Africa's role in the church's future.
Right. And he hears Troaré'S voice not just as political resistance, but as prophecy.
That's a significant framing.
It is. He sees Africa not as the world's burden, but maybe its beacon, a wellspring of faith, miracles, prophetic fire.
And he critiques the church itself.
Yeah, for too often speaking to Africa rather than with Africa, a one-way conversation.
But he sees that changing.
He points to African missionaries now going out to the world, bringing their faith, their songs, their conviction. He insists African Christianity isn't just borrowed.
It's born there. He gives examples.
Martyrs of Uganda, the Desert Fathers in Egypt, ancient roots. And he talks about the vibrant faith in African churches today.
And then that really strong line.
Africa is not the church's future. She is its present. She is its soul.
Wow. That centers Africa in a completely different way.
It does. He even points to Burkina Faso itself, where Christians and Muslims have died defending each other's right to worship.
Seeing the church's rebirth in places like that.
In the crucible of courage, he calls it. And he asks, will the church make room for African prophets? Meaning inviting African theologies rooted in things like Ubuntu, respect for ancestors into the global conversation, seeing African spirituality as a sacred lens.
And prophecy might not look like we expect.
Exactly. It might come from outside traditional religious figures too. The point is, the church needs to listen, really listen.
He confronts the past arrogance. Faith being universal in name, but often Western in practice.
Yes, and calls for concrete changes. More African cardinals, canonizing modern African saints, teaching African theology as essential.
Tackling that subtle racism within church structures.
Yeah, celebrating the sheer vibrancy of African worship. He wants the church to be like a symphony.
With the Vatican as a circle where Africa is revered, not on the margins.
Right. He hopes his papacy is marked by walking with, learning from, defending Africa. He feels the spirit moving there.
So finally, he brings it all together. Unforgiveness, unity, a new beginning.
Yeah, he frames the whole response as being about reconciliation, not forgetting the past, but transforming it.
Acknowledging the wounds are deep.
Very deep. But he praises Troaré'S for seeking dignity and renewal, not vengeance.
And he defines forgiveness in an interesting way.
As sanctifying memory, turning that burning flame into a guiding light. It's strength, he says, not submission.
But there's a crucial condition.
Yes. Forgiveness without justice is an insult. Unity without truth is a lie. That's fundamental.
And he suggests Africa might be the soul of humanity's future.
He does. And the church's role is to walk alongside as a partner, a pilgrim. Shared humanity.
Echoing that idea of the last shall be first. Maybe it's Africa's time.
Perhaps. And he proposes concrete steps again.
Like what?
A council of memory and mercy, African leaders, Vatican people working together, and a Vatican-African commission.
To do what specifically?
To audit the church's conscience, basically. To listen before preaching, heal before instructing.
And creating space in Rome for African liturgies.
As central, not marginal. It's all about the humility of dialogue, he says. He hopes this whole exchange is the start of something real, a covenant.
And he ends with a prayer for President Traoré, asks for his prayers too.
Yeah. A message of peace, hope, brotherhood. Ouagadougou to Rome.
So when you pull it all together, it's quite something.
It really is a remarkable response, acknowledging history, solidarity with present struggles, and this vision for a future where Africa is absolutely central, transformative for the church.
It feels like a truly unique moment, this kind of dialogue.
It does. Between religious and political leadership on this level, tackling these issues, it's rare.
So the final thought for you, our listener.
Yeah, maybe think about what the Pope's words imply, not just for the church in Africa, but maybe for how we all understand history, injustice, economic inequality, cultural respect globally.
What does it really take for institutions, for individuals to move past just saying sorry?
Right, to get to genuine repentance, genuine action. What does that actually look like in practice?